Welcome to the screencast for An Essay Concerning Human Understanding by John Locke. So John Locke's that man right over there on the right. On the left, you might recognize another John Locke if you've ever watched the television show Lost. And once you learn about the historical John Lost, maybe you'll see if they named him appropriately. So some background. John Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. He had an ongoing discourse with Descartes and his ideas, so back and forth in journals and papers and books. So Descartes, as we saw bits and pieces of evidence from the last screencast, he is a rationalist, meaning he thinks that we can get knowledge about the external world by using the mind and reason alone. So Locke, on the other hand, is firmly an empiricist. He thinks that we get ideas and knowledge from experience and the external world alone. Just like Descartes, he was a polymath. He was a prolific philosopher. He wrote about metaphysics, epistemology, personal identity, science, politics, and more. His second treatise of government is still taught in political science classes, and it articulates a rational, reasoned argument as to why the people are the ones who give government legitimacy. The government just doesn't take it or have it on its own. He too lived in a time of dramatic socio-political change. Not only was he also alive during the Enlightenment and that big change from scholasticism to the so-called Age of Reason, he was an English philosopher. And at the time, there was civil war, and the crown was fighting with people who didn't want a monarchy anymore, and the Protestants were fighting the Catholics. And out of this turmoil, we get eventually the American Revolution, and we get treatises about democracy becoming fundamental to the way we run our world. So the excerpt that we're reading comes from a really long book, 400 plus pages, and we only get 4, 5, 6 pages in our textbook. And this book looks at human knowledge. It's his work about epistemology. What is knowledge? Where does it come from? And are there limits to human knowledge? In this massive book, there are 4 sub-books. Book 1 argues against innate ideas and against rationalism. Book 2 tackles the categorization of experience. That's the one we're going to eventually look at in our selection. Book 3 deals with words and linguistics and how they relate to knowledge and epistemology. Book 4 discusses knowledge as a whole, what the limits are, and what we might mean by truth. So we're going to look at how Locke built up his ideas about what experience is. So within the entire branch of epistemology, we're going to look at the subsection that asks how we obtain knowledge. How do we get it? So first he looks at experience as a whole, and he splits it into 2. We generally think there's a difference between the ideas in our heads and the actions of bodies in the world. So the mind-body split again. Same thing from Russell with the ideas being the mind and the sense data being the external world. So we just can't get away from this mind-body split. Locke defines an idea as whatsoever the mind perceives in itself or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding. So this is that stipulative definition that we looked at a few modules ago. He's saying that this is what he means when he says the word idea. And the power of an object in the world to produce that idea in us is called a quality. So anything that's out there, a book, a bridge, an apple, that object has qualities, and it has a power somehow to come into our heads and make us see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, or think or reason about it. So an object has qualities like color, shape, hardness, quantity, and movement. And whatever it is that we understand about those qualities are our ideas. So now he splits the idea of qualities into two. He says there are primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are the things that belong to the object inherently. That means that primary qualities are utterly inseparable from the body in what state soever it will be. So if you look at the top right picture, you can see that the shape of an object and how solid it is, whether or not it's moving, that belongs to the actual form of the object itself. Secondary qualities, however, are not part of the form of the piece of matter itself. It's not in the object, it's in us. It arises because it interacts with our sense organs. So primary qualities, like I said, include shape, motion, solidity, and three-dimensionality. That's what philosophers mean when they talk about extension. And secondary qualities are smell and color and texture and taste. So the only way for the outside world to interact with us, Locke says, is by impulse. So when he says by impulse, what he means is there has to be a direct physical link between our human senses and the outside world. Something has to physically touch us for it to create an idea in our minds about it. And back then they didn't have a theory of atoms and molecules or sound waves. But Locke kind of prefigures this. He says that the interaction is from, quote, insensible particles, meaning we can't sense the particles on the macro level, but they must be there. Primary and secondary qualities are alike in the fact that they both interact with us, with these insensible particles. But primary qualities give us an accurate picture of the way the object really is, and secondary qualities do not. And we can take a look at why this is with the Manna example. So this is paragraph 18 on page 101. So you might have run into the concept of manna from the Bible. So it was supposed to be this magical or important plant that could regenerate every day to feed the Israelites in the desert. But it's also been the name of several different kinds of plants throughout history. And I think that's what Locke means when he uses it as his example, a plant. And he talks about how if the plant is moving, that's why I have the dandelion seeds there. The seeds might be moving, or somebody might be carrying the plant. The plant is actually moving. It doesn't matter that there's an outside force moving it, but the body itself is in motion. It's changing places in space and in time. The shape of the plant is part of it. Number of leaves, or the number of seeds, or how solid it is. That's all part of its corporeal bodily existence. If we eat it, however, we might smell it first, and the insensible particles, which we now know are molecules, aromatic molecules that come off of the food and into our nose, then it's not a matter of that being part of the actual body. It's how those molecules or insensible particles interact with our nose and our brain. And if we eat it and we feel full, or it makes us sick, the sickness and the illness isn't in the plant itself, it's in us. And that's how he differentiates between primary and secondary qualities. At the end of this section, he mentions a third category of quality. He only talks about it in our excerpt for a couple of short paragraphs. But he's talking about the power to change another body, or the perception of that body. So the forces of the world, the physical forces of the world are another quality. So fire has the power to burn. And we have the power to do a lot. We can crumple up papers. We can change shapes of matter and material. So that's a third kind of quality that a body might have. Then on page 102, he has another section, and it's called Our Knowledge of the Existence of Other Things. And in this section, he's responding directly to Descartes and his doubt about the external world. First, he says that we know we personally exist with our bodies and our minds through immediate intuition. We immediately understand that we have bodies and we can reason. And every single other thing comes from sensations from the external world. And he has a lot of counter arguments, and you might think some of them are stronger than others. The first thing he says on the outset is, all we have are our senses. If they aren't certain, they're the closest thing we can get to being certain. Then he might be making a little bit of a joke here, but he says, if a person doubts everything, you can never even be sure someone else is coming and arguing against you. You would have to doubt that as well. Another one is that pleasure and pain, everybody has them, and they're good indicators that you are going to be able to handle an experience or not handle an experience. If something's too hot, you need to walk away. And there's no reason that that tool would exist if there was no external world. It is a tool, and that's the ability to distinguish pain and pleasure, to inform us about the outside world. One of the stronger arguments, I personally think, is that sense organs and our minds can't come up with new things all on their own. You can imagine someone who's blind from birth. They can't imagine color. Or if there's a fruit you've never tasted, like a pineapple, do you know what it smells like or tastes like? You can't come up with it in your head. You need to experience it first. Another counter-argument to Descartes, Locke says, is sometimes we can't avoid sensations, even if we want to. If we think it's too bright and we close our eyes, the sun still burns on our eyelids, and there's the orange glow. If we're next to a rose, we can't not smell it, because we might not want to. And if we put our hand into a fire, it will always hurt. Another counter-argument is that our senses create similar ideas in many people. And further, we have, as people, the power to manipulate objects. He uses the example of writing letters on a page. But once you do that manipulation, you can't just will it to be different. It's going to obey the laws of physics and the laws of the world. Things don't just change because we want them to. There are rules about the outside world. And it might look like he's avoiding the main issue here, because I think Descartes would concede to all of this. Just because there are rules in our experience, though, doesn't mean that those rules match what the world really is. They can just be given to us by God or by the demon, or we could all be dreaming. But Locke says, so what? Even if we are, it's all we have. All we have to build knowledge is our experience. And since we have that, we can still find patterns of information, and that's our knowledge. So another way of putting this is pain, whether it comes in the form of a dream or it comes from the external world. So I want you to think about whether or not you think Locke's arguments against Descartes' method of doubt are convincing, and why or why not.